Since I was young, I have loved books. From being read the stories within by my parents to learning to read and being able to discover the adventures within, my appreciation for the written word has always been part of my life. When I was in high school, I began collecting books. At first, it was purely by accident, just a series of novels collected from my favorite authors. When I graduated and moved out, I realized that I had amassed nearly 100 books, a mass that was difficult to find a place for when I moved into a studio apartment. Despite my lack of space, I still would find myself buying books from my local bookstore every month. When I moved out of my tiny apartment into a 2-bedroom apartment, my best friend Lexi mentioned that it was a good thing I had picked a place with a room where I could store my collection of books, which had tripled in size in the 4 years since I moved out on my own. It was after I set the last box of books in what was soon to be my home office that she mentioned that I could probably make some money off of the books that I had acquired. With all of these books in here, I'm sure there are a handful that are actually worth more than what you paid for, Lexi said, looking at an old first edition of The Great Gatsby that I had stacked on a precarious pile of J.R.R. Tolkien and C.S. Lewis novels. I wouldn't even know where to begin. Plus, I like having these tomes of history to surround me, I replied as I glanced at the confusing IKEA instructions for the first of many bookshelves that I would be building throughout the evening. Just look online, I am sure you'll be able to find a place that buys old books. You might even make enough money to add more to your collection, she replied before grabbing us a couple beers for the long night ahead of us. With that simple suggestion, I entered into a rabbit hole of buying and reselling books, always certain to add to my collection more than what I sold off. I began searching estate sales and Goodwill for old books that I could add to my collection, and on the rare occasion sell off for more book spending money. It was during one of my visits to an estate sale in a neighboring city that I found a peculiar book among a shelf of first editions and misprinted first runs. Bound in blue leather with an intricate gold trim was a book called 999 New Beginnings by C. Fuel. Before I was able to open the book to begin to identify how old the book was, the liquidator of the estate said that the collection of books could be mine for a bargain. $9,000 later, a price I was certain to make up for with the selling of a first edition of Blood Meridian. I gathered my new friends and returned home to my own personal fire hazard of a collection. After I listed a few of my recent purchases online, I picked up the 999 New Beginnings and turned to the copyright page. However, I could not find the page in the first few pages of the tome. Instead, after a few blank pages, I saw the table of contents listing off the sections within. While it did not list 999 individual stories, it did list off 9 different sections within the book. This did not make deciphering the contents any easier, as it simply listed off what I could only assume were an antiquated understanding of elements. Fire written in red, ice written in a light blue, wind written in a light green, earth written in a tannish brown, thunder written in a vibrant yellow, water written in a deep blue, shadow written in a dark gray, holy written in a silvery gray, void written in a royal purple. My curiosity was instantly piqued as each section did not have any corresponding page numbers. With no further clues, I began reading the first story. The first story, with fire and earth above, told of a poor boy that lived within a desert kingdom. He struggled to find work and had to rely on his cunning to steal food to feed himself and his elderly mother. When he was caught by the royal guard, he avoided death by convincing the guards that he was actually the prince of the neighboring kingdom. When the Sultan heard of the guards' disgraceful behavior, he begged the prince to marry his daughter to avoid the potential war that could arise for false imprisonment of the prince. The boy agreed and married the daughter and had his elderly mother join them as his personal confidant. The story was simple, but while reading it, I felt the oddest sensation. I could feel the desert heat and smell the fresh baked bread as though I was reading the book in that fictional place rather than in my air-conditioned apartment. I could feel my mouth drying out from the heat of a burning sun above, and had to pause to get a glass of water before I could keep reading the book. When the boy celebrated his wedding and drank wine and ate fruit, I could almost taste the flavors of what the book was describing. To me, the allure of books is their ability to make the reader feel like they are present in the story they are reading. It is why I had been so devoted in my love for books, but the book I had stumbled upon did by far the best in making me feel like I was actually there. I turned to the next story, Water and Wind, depicting a story of a fisherman catching a fish that was told to be impossible to catch. The entire time I read, I could smell the salty air and could almost feel the wind blowing mists of water onto my hair. When his boat capsized, it was as if I too was struggling to catch my breath as the man untangled himself from his net and swam his way up for air. When he finally took in a lungful of air and began to cough up water, I too had the sensation of coughing water out of my lungs. When the man made his way back to shore and entered the lighthouse and collapsed by his fireplace, I too could feel the warmth of the fire spread across my own shivering form. Despite the second story having a much more physical reaction out of me, I was unable to set the book down. I was drawn to the complete immersion I had while reading such simple yet captivating stories. I carried the book with me to the kitchen to grab a cup of coffee before reading the next story with the words Ice, Wind, and Shadow written above. The third story was set on the Bering Land Bridge and followed a nomadic tribe as they hunted a mammoth. The chill of the cold climate ached at my bones, and I had to grab a blanket and turn off my air conditioning. A deep hunger began to ache in my stomach as the text described the weeks without any meat, and the meager provisions quickly diminished. When the tribe was forced to consume the flesh of those who had dropped due to starvation, I could feel the repulsive lurch in my stomach, as though I too had partaken in the morbid consumption of human flesh. With the success of taking down the great beast near the end of the passage, I joyfully celebrated with the characters as they danced around a fire and praised their god for the successful hunt. However, when the tribe reached a strange new world, one of the characters fell and broke her leg and was left behind, as the rest of the tribe ventured onward. With the close of the story, I began to feel a deep ache in my leg. While clearly my leg did not have a piece of bone jutting out, there was a ghostly pain as though I had once broken my leg years ago. I sat the book down and walked towards the bathroom. The sudden heat of the summer day permeated, and my decision to turn off my air conditioning seemed to have been a poor decision. I turned the unit back on, mildly amused that I had been so engrossed in the story that I had also joined in the freezing temperatures. It was as I staggered towards the bathroom that I realized my steps were not like my usual stride. I could still feel the phantom pain in my leg despite never having received an injury like that before. I decided that sleep was all that I needed. I had obviously engrossed myself into the book and just needed some rest. A glance at the clock revealing that it was already well into the early morning confirmed my decision, and I laid down for the night. Sleep welcomed me with dreams of desert kingdoms, fishing boats by lighthouses, and cold nights of desperation in search of food that wasn't human. Upon waking, I checked my laptop to see that a couple of my listings were already purchased and hastily prepped the books to be shipped. With a quick run to the post office and a stop at a local bookstore to buy a couple Grisham and Patterson novels, I returned home to continue reading the strange book I had acquired. The fourth story, Thunder and Holy, marked at the top of the page, told of the youngest son of a noble family joining the clergy. When the middle brother was killed during the 30 Years' War, and the oldest brother was excommunicated for his blasphemous beliefs against the church, the youngest brother was sought after to take charge of the family holdings. As he prayed for guidance for what he should do, a bolt of lightning struck the fir tree he would often sit under when he would think back about his childhood. As the tree burned down, I could smell the scent of burnt wood and light rain fill the air. The man decided that it was a sign to forsake his past and stay true to his faith. He refused the call and remained a clergyman, gaining much notoriety for his devotion. He died an old man respected by the community for his devotion to faith, his family name forgotten along with any status that they once held. I immediately jumped into the next story labeled as Shadow and Void. The story followed a young man who was recruited by his twin sister and her friends as their designated driver and drink observer. There had been a string of girls that had gone out and had disappeared without a trace. The young man vigilantly watched out over his sister and her friends, placing his hand over drinks and tossing them out when unsavory characters lingered for too long near them. Strangely, the book had what looked like a couple of missing pages. Inspecting the book closer, I noticed the slight fray of the remnants of the pages. An overwhelming disappointment filled me as key details of the story would be missing, but I relented and continued reading. A strange sensation of dread filled me as I continued reading. With a quick step, the young man caught up with his sister. He palmed the pill he was given by the overly friendly receptionist before tossing a breath mint into his mouth to dissuade her from any further inquiry. He entered the elevator with his sister before reassuring her that everything would be fine and that they would find her friends. As the elevator doors closed, they began to descend, his sister reaching for her head with slow and unsteady movements. He reached out for his sister, trying to catch her before she fell, when the sound of rushing air filled the small chamber and gas obfuscated his view. He began coughing, struggling to catch his breath, as I too could feel my lungs begin to fill with a foreign gas. He dropped to the ground as his vision blurred before falling into darkness. I had entered into a trance-like state, unable to pull myself from the pages of the book. My hands, no longer my own, turned the page. Every nerve in my body screamed in protest as a flood of pain howled to my core. The man was suspended, looking out at his sister as her body was cut open and vivisected. Pieces of her spread out into silver trays next to the medical table she laid upon. Glancing over towards a mirror erected at the foot of his own table, the man saw but could not comprehend the sight that mocked him. He was nothing but a collection of his nervous system, connected to his eyes and brain. His physical form not even a shell of its former self. Instead, it was a loose series of cords attached to a fatty chunk of gray. If he had a mouth, it would be screaming in terror. One of the men in sterile white casually looked over at his form, expressionless due to the face mask and strange glasses. With a few steps, the fiend in a doctor's disguise approached a machine and made a few keystrokes before the young man returned to darkness. When the world returned, he was screaming. He began to ask of his sister and what happened to him, but was met with only confusion. He didn't have a sister. He was an only child, and the people standing over him were his caretakers. When he sheepishly looked towards the mirror at the foot of his bed, the terror paralyzed him. Looking back at him was a face he did not recognize. He was in a body that was not his own. He closed his eyes and began to pray that he would wake up from the hellish nightmare he had to be in. I finally regained control of my body as the story concluded. My hands shook and I raced to the bathroom to look at myself. With a sigh of relief, the reflection I saw was my own. I returned to the book and closed it. After a few breaths, I opened it to be greeted with the words, "Holy in Shadow" at the top of the page. A priestess stood before her followers and warned of invaders from the south coming to take their lands and spread their heresy. The tribes rebuked her as all who had challenged their might before had fallen. Despite her warnings of the threat being like any seen before, none heeded her call. 3 weeks later, men draped in tunics made of metal raided their villages with shields decorated with stars and crosses. They razed the buildings and desecrated the places of worship. As the priestess ran through the settlement, fire engulfing the place she had lived for 16 winters, she was unable to outrun the powerful beasts, dressed in the garb of their conquering commanders. A net reminiscent of the ones that her father had used when he would gather heaps of fish was cast over her. Entangled in the ropes, she felt just as the creatures of the sea struggling for freedom. As she was bound and dragged from her home, she watched as the burning village grew smaller and smaller until only the faint glow of destruction was all that could be seen in the horizon. Sat beside several other women and a few badly bruised men, the foreign invaders tossed small chunks of dense hardtack for the lot of them and a small mouthful of bitter wine. They yelled in a tongue that the priestess could not understand, but a man amongst the soldiers that was one of her kinsmen, but dressed more like the soldiers translated for them. He told the captives to forsake their gods and accept the blasphemy of the invaders, that the key to survival was to accept the new way of life. While the others did as they were told and mimed the strange words as they were told, the priestess refused and spat the bitter wine and stale food out at the towering figure standing before her. Refusing to renounce her faith for the lies of invaders, the priestess was forced to her feet. The determined look in her eyes mirrored her resolve. Her resolve was broken as her eyes were gouged out with a burning hot blade. My eyes seared with pain and I dropped the book. I rushed to the bathroom, bumping into everything as I cried out in pain. The cold water I splashed onto my face soothed the fiery pain until I regained my sight a few minutes later. I dropped back and sat on the floor, resting my head against the wall as I contemplated the bizarre physical responses that I had experienced while reading this strange book. Despite every warning signal in my brain to leave the book alone, I returned to finish the story. The former priestess did as her attackers commanded. She ate their food, drank their bitter wine, and mimicked their alien tongue. Her world was now dark. The sight she had been blessed with to see the warnings of the future were now cut off, as she was no longer able to see anything ever again. Guided to an unknown and unlikely future, whenever she was commanded to do something, she did. The encouraging words of her kinsmen did little to mend her soul. She was held in high regard, but because of her warning being belittled, none of them would be able to practice what would become the old ways ever again. The story ended with an unforeseen future for the former priestess. As my hand prickled with pins and needles throughout, I turned the page and read the top of the next page. It was titled with the royal purple of the word, Void. Hesitantly, I began to read the next story. There was a young woman who was afraid she would disappear. I closed the book immediately and tossed it across the room. I did not want to know what the remainder of the story told. I still fear what the story could unveil for me if I was to continue. Yet every day I see the peculiar book I'd acquired and can feel it call me to open the pages and dive more into the tales it contains. Every story I've read, I have felt the experiences it has contained inside. What would happen if I read more of a story about someone who feared disappearing and ended up disappearing in the story? It is a fate I do not want to tempt. The book still calls for a reader. How much longer can I resist?